My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I am back. First off, sorry for getting this podcast out late. Normally, I put podcast out early Saturday morning. I'm recording this Sunday, April 16th. I should have had this out on April 15th for all of my American listeners who are rushing to finish their taxes, but things got in the way, and then completely unrelated to taxes. These past couple of weeks, I've been doing some reporting for different outlets, the China Project, and I'm also working on a project, a new China magazine that's coming out probably later in the fall. And I have just not been able to record in time. I'm sorry, I will try and do better and get these out every 2 weeks on Saturday morning. But enough for apologies. Let's turn to today's text. 4 weeks ago, I did a podcast on sex workers in Dalian and their poetry. The host of the fantastic China History podcast, my friend Laszlo Montgomery, told me it was, quote, risque but interesting. I take that as an endorsement, as he was worried a bit that people might not like it, but my numbers actually went up on that episode. So here I am again. I'm going to talk about sex, women, and exchange, but today's episode is going to be significantly less risque because we are going all the way back to the Han Dynasty. Today, I will look at a poem by Liu Xijun. This poem is called 悲愁歌, Song of Sadness. Liu Xijun was a princess from the Western Han Dynasty. Her story has two strands, and I'm going to try and right now meld those strands together. So, the first strand, in the Western Han Dynasty, that's roughly the period from 202 BC to 9 AD. Right smack dab in the middle of that period is the reign of Han Wudi, that is, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty. He is one of the most famous emperors of all time, reigning from 141 BC to 87 BC. He's one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history, Han Wudi. One thing to mention about his name, early Chinese imperial names are often three characters. The Han just refers to Han Dynasty, the Di just means emperor, and Wu is his reign name. So it literally meant something like Emperor Wu of the Han. When he was born, his name was Liu Che, Liu being the family name of all Han Dynasty emperors. Han Wudi is famous for some of his economic reforms that are highly controversial. He's also famous for fighting lots of barbarians to China's north, particularly this group of barbarians known as the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu are a nomadic state that roamed the areas of modern-day Mongolia, southern Siberia, and whatnot. Before Han Wudi, the Han had mostly dealt with the Xiongnu by making deals with them. It's called Heqin diplomacy, or in Chinese, it's just Heqin. He literally means having harmonious relationships. He is harmonious. Qin is to make someone family. It literally means family. So Heqin diplomacy literally means something like bringing harmony by making them family. This involved marrying off princesses to the Xiongnu and giving the Xiongnu money as a bribe. Both the women and the money functioned as a bribe for them not to attack the Han state. And it was actually pretty successful and cost effective. Han Wudi famously decided he was going to dump that program and bring the pain to the Xiongnu. One of the things that he did do to go after the Xiongnu, he actually struck up alliances with the enemies of the Xiongnu, particularly those even farther to the west. So if the Xiongnu were going east to threaten the Han state, Han Wudi said, yes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he struck up a partnership with the Wusun. These are a group of barbarians that lived in what today is the Ili Valley of the modern PRC and parts of Kazakhstan, all the way into the areas of eastern Kyrgyzstan, particularly surrounding Lake Issyk, which, just as a plug, if you're not aware of my pre-podcast life, I got a grant with a friend, Galen Burke, from Outside Magazine. We got $10,000. We attempted to hitchhike the Silk Road from Xi'an to Kashgar and on into Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. If you want to see Galen's pictures and my writing on Lake Issyk, go to silkroadhitchhikers.com. That's silkroadhitchhikers with an S.com. Okay, I'm done with the shameless plugs. Let's get back to the Wusun. The Wusun and the Xiongnu had sometimes allied together, but they were not always the best of friends. Han Wudi sent a messenger to the Wusun. His name was Zhang Qian. He's frequently referred to in China as the guy who founded the Silk Road. That's really more legend than true, but He's an important figure. He goes on this mission, tries to find the Wusun. He's captured by the Xiongnu, imprisoned for years, escapes, makes it to the Wusun. He actually gets to the Wusun. He gets to his goal. He comes back to Han Wudi's court as this magnificent surprise and said, hey, we have ourselves an alliance with the Wusun. That is the first strand of Liu Xijun's amazing story. That's the geopolitical background. The second strand of Liu Xijun's story is about domestic politics and her place in that. Liu Xijun was of royal blood, Han Jingdi. This is the guy who reigned before Han Wudi. Emperor Han Jingdi was Liu Xijun's great-grandfather and also the grandfather of Emperor Han Wudi. Sorry, there's a lot of names coming at you. So Han Jingdi, Emperor Jing, he is the great-grandfather of Liu Xijun, and he is the grandfather of Han Wudi. You don't have to keep these names they're not super important, but what's important to keep in mind is that she was a real princess. She's directly descended through the male line, which is important in Han Dynasty politics, through the male line of an emperor. She's related to the current emperor. She is directly descended from this earlier emperor, but her family got into trouble. This is not of her own doing. Her dad, Liu Jian, this is the nephew of the emperor and himself a king. A king's not really the right word, but in the Han Dynasty, Wang, that is, today we use that in Chinese to just mean king. That was something like a lord of a small region. Anyways, he's this important political figure who has power. He and Liu Xijun's mom, they started a rebellion against the emperor. Han Wudi does not play around. What was the punishment for starting a rebellion against the emperor? It's called Yi Sanzu. What was the Yi Sanzu punishment? Not fun. This is a punishment that's common. I say common, but it happens in China, in Vietnam, Korea, in East Asian societies. You, as the criminal, do not just get punished. Your whole family gets killed. That includes the criminal's living parents, the criminal's living grandparents, any kids or grandkids that you had over a certain age. Any kids under that age would be enslaved. Kids and grandkids, the criminal's spouse, the siblings and siblings-in-law, uncles, aunts, and all of their spouses, any cousins you have, your spouse, of course, and the spouse's parents. And usually, this was not like an easy kind of chopping off the head. Execution was normally done for this punishment by slow slicing. Yikes. So her dad rebels, and she was herself about to get executed by slow slicing. But here's where those two strands of the story come together, the geopolitical strand and the domestic political strand. Han Wudi needed a princess to send off to the hairy barbarian Wusuns. He obviously doesn't really want to send any of his own daughters off. He's just about to kill Liu Xijun, and he thinks, wait, she's a legit princess. Instead of killing her, why not just save himself the trouble of having to have one of his own direct descendants sent off? So he sends her off to the Wusun. This happened sometimes around 110, 105 BC, and those two strands are the backdrop to this poem, which we're going to turn to right now. I'm just going to dive into my translation of the poem. Again, as always, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com is going to have this translation plus the original up on the website. Check it out if you're interested. Here is the translation. My family married me off, to the ends of the earth. Far away they entrusted me in a foreign country, to the king of the Wusuns. The yurt is the best they can do for a building, felt the best they can do for walls. Meat is their meal, cheese is their soup. Living here for a while, I think, and my heart hurts. I wish I could become a swan, and return to my home. So first off, I think as we look at this poem, it's pretty clear that Liu Xijun did not think much of this marriage. She doesn't say it in this poem, but the king of the Wusuns that she was married off to, his name is in Chinese, Liu Jiaofei. No clue as to what that was originally in Wusun. Liu Jiaofei himself is quite old. She is quite young. You get the picture. Let's break down the poem a little bit. In lines 1 and 2, that first couplet, we start in China. Then we move away from it. My family married me off, oh, to the ends of the earth. Far away, they entrusted me in a foreign country, oh, to the king of the Wusuns. She feels like she is in this faraway, distant land. Of course, for the Wusun, she's right in the center of their world, but for her, she's kind of moved to the edge of civilization. Think Luke Skywalker at the beginning of New Hope. Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that is farthest from. That's kind of the feeling that Liu Xijun, I think, is articulating here. I think also there is the sense that she is being traded here, that this is a kind of economic transaction that's going on here. And I think that's inherent in the word that she is choosing. And she really doesn't like being traded, especially off to this distant place. Everything is different in this new environment, and in her eyes, worse. Instead of real buildings, I should say, so there's a sense that the yurts that they have in the Wusun community, they're not real buildings to her. The yurt, of course, is a tent structure that Mongols and other Central Asians use as their main form of building. You can relatively easily move them across the steppe. So when you're migrating, going after your sheep, it's fairly easy to pick them up and move them. Their walls are made out of felt. They're quite cozy, actually. I've slept in yurts many a night. But if you're expecting some grand palace, which I think Liu Xijun, considering that her father was a king, a Wang, in the Han Dynasty, this is definitely a step down. In line 4, she complains about the food. Normally, she would eat something other than meat and have for soup something that is not cheese. Of course, cheese and other dairy products were central to the cuisine of Central Asians. Today and back in the past, dairy products aren't really a big deal. At least it seems like that from Liu Xijun's poem. You can imagine if, as so many people in East Asia today are, if Liu Xijun is lactose intolerant, that this would be a pretty rough transition for her. Back to the poem, lines 5 and line 6, bring it back home. She's affected by this melancholia. She's living in this faraway land. She misses home. And in line 6, she either wishes or dreams or something. She becomes a swan and flies back to her home. The word in Chinese is gushang, literally something like hometown or home region. There's the sense that the poem has come full circle. This is a pretty common thing in Chinese poetry, the circling back from the place that the poem starts, it goes out, and then it circles back to the place where it started. It's interesting, some folks have suggested that the circling back is inherent in all Chinese poetry. I'm not so sure I would make that claim, but it is interesting in this poem that is about her going away, that no matter what, she has to come back to her hometown. There's a story that when Liu Xijun arrived, she came bearing lots of gifts from Emperor Hamudi. She had vehicles that the imperial family used to travel. She had fancy clothes, and these were all given to the Wusun common people, the Lao Baixing. And that made her really popular. I bring that up because in this poem, it's interesting, Liu Xijun doesn't have any complaints about the people. I think we can maybe see some complaints possibly hinted at about her love life, about her being paired with this really old dude. There are clearly complaints about her material conditions in life, the places she has to live, the food she has to eat. A lot of Chinese texts look down on barbarians. I mean, even the use of that word in Chinese is, of course, contains in itself this insult. There's nothing really like that in Liu Xijun's poem, though. She's not looking down on the people. I think that's fascinating because as I was doing research on this poem, I read an article on Baidu about this poem. It describes her marriage using the term xia jia. That literally means to be marrying down. Xia is down and jia is when a woman gets married. So from this modern Baidu article, what it's suggesting is that because she's a Chinese princess, she's marrying down to this barbarian king because this barbarian king, because he's a barbarian, is inherently beneath a Chinese woman. I was surprised to read that because that attitude, yes, that was normal back in the Han Dynasty period. But for a modern Chinese text, that is one that's written in the past 5 or 10 years, to say that's politically incorrect. And I mean politically incorrect in the Chinese sense. The Wusun are by some considered ancestors of some of today's 少数民族, the ethnic minorities in the PRC. It's expected that they're going to be treated as one of the glorious ancestors of some Chinese citizens. That is at least the way it's theoretically supposed to work. But that Baidu article is not doing that. It has this very traditional attitude of looking down at the Wusun. It has this very traditional attitude of looking down on the Wusun. Liu Xijun doesn't have any of that. She is completely free of any sort of racism, I guess is the right word, racial bigotry. What she is criticizing is very much about culture. It's about food. It's about material living conditions. It's where she's living. It's what she's eating, which I think is kind of heartening. Even though she is complaining about living in this barren land, she's at least doing it in a way that seems to me quite reasonable. I mean, as someone who's lived in China and had to come back to America, I complain all the time about American food and how much better the food is in China. When I read this poem, I feel a lot like I can empathize with Liu Xijun. I feel like she and I could have this conversation over some good Mao She Hong Xiao Rou and complain about the barbaric food, whether it be in the Wusun community or whether it be in Oregon. I think we could get along. One of the things I like most about looking back at these kinds of texts is finding that sense of self, seeing myself in the mirror of these ancient Chinese figures and recognizing that me and them, you and me, we're not all that different. I think that's something that really heartens me when I look back at these old texts. Is 2,000 years, an ocean separates us, but those things aren't really that big. Okay, I've gone on long enough. This poem, in case you're wondering, is preserved in the Han Shu, the history of the Han Dynasty. And that's where most of her story is coming from. Check out my website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you loved today's show, if you hated today's show, if you think I bang on too long at the end about togetherness or similarity, let me know your thoughts. Send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. I love getting emails from listeners. I'm not always the best at following up on them, but I will eventually get to them. Also, I'm actually heading to Taiwan for much of the month of May. If you're a listener in Taiwan and would want to meet up, I'll be in Taipei mostly, but I will go to probably down to Tainan and maybe over to the East Coast some. If you want to meet up, shoot me an email. I'd love to get together with some pengyo while I'm there. Also, if you're looking for ways to support the podcast, check out my Patreon page, Chinese Literature Podcast. I'd love it if you'd support me if you feel like I'm doing a good job. Today's Chengyu is going to be 豆蔻年华. It means a girl in her early teens. It's someone who's young and pretty. And this is one of the Chengyus that I learned in reading that Baidu Baike article on Liu Xijun being married off to old king of the Wusuns. So that is it. Whether or not you as a listener are a person who is 豆蔻年华, or whether you are like me, someone who, as Dante would say, is in the middle of the journey of life, I'm happy to have you as a listener. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.